The spotlight cuts through the darkness, illuminating a trembling man in a gray janitor's uniform clutching a microphone. Behind him, platinum-selling artist Vanessa Reeves smirks, her entourage of dancers barely containing their laughter. No one expects what happens next, a voice so pure it silences an arena of 20,000 people. This is the story of Marco Diaz, a man who mopped floors by day and sang lullabies by night, whose hidden gift was about to change everything. If you're moved by stories of underdogs rising against all odds, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that remind us all of the extraordinary potential hiding within ordinary lives. Marco Diaz's knuckles whitened around the handle of his mop as he worked the backstage area of the Westfield Arena. At 42, his body felt twice its age, shoulders permanently hunched from years of bending over floors, knees creaking in protest with each movement. But he kept going, he always did. His daughter Sophia's face flashed in his mind, her bright 11-year-old smile the fuel that powered him through double shifts and weekend work. "Hey, mop man. We need a cleanup in dressing room 3. Someone spilled champagne." The voice belonged to one of Vanessa Reeves' assistants, a young woman who hadn't once made eye contact with Marco in the 3 days the tour had been setting up. "Right away," Marco replied, though she had already walked away, phone pressed to her ear. As he pushed his cart toward the dressing rooms, the faint sound of Vanessa Reeves rehearsing drifted through the corridor. Marco paused, closing his eyes briefly. Her latest hit, Unstoppable, was technically impressive, but something about it felt hollow to him, all production and no soul. Marco had once dreamed of a music career himself. Before Sofia, before his wife Maria's cancer diagnosis, before becoming a widowed father at 35, he had sung in local bands and even recorded a few demos. Now, music was something private, shared only with Sophia during bedtime songs or while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. Inside dressing room 3, the spilled champagne had soaked into an expensive-looking rug. As Marco worked, he hummed softly, an old ballad his grandmother had taught him. The melody always brought him peace. "That's pretty." Marco startled, nearly knocking over his bucket. A young man with kind eyes and a lanyard identifying him as Alex Chen, production assistant, stood in the doorway. "Sorry," Marco mumbled, embarrassed to be caught singing. "No, seriously. You've got a great voice. Were you ever trained?" Marco shook his head. "Just church choir as a kid." Alex seemed about to say something else when his walkie-talkie crackled. "Gotta run. Sound check in 5. He hesitated at the door. "You know, Vanessa's doing this audience participation bit tonight. Pick someone from the crowd to sing with her. It's all staged, of course, plants in the audience. But the way you sing, just saying, you should try to get a ticket." Marco smiled politely but said nothing. Tickets to Vanessa Reeves' sold-out show cost more than his weekly grocery budget. Besides, tonight was his late shift, followed by an early morning tomorrow. Sophia would be staying with his mother-in-law, as she did whenever his shifts overlapped with school hours. The arena hummed with anticipation as 20,000 fans waited for Vanessa Reeves to take the stage. Backstage, Marco emptied trash cans and wiped down surfaces, trying to stay invisible as crew members rushed past. "You. Janitor." The sharp voice cut through the pre-show chaos. Marco turned to find himself face to face with Vanessa Reeves herself, surrounded by stylists making last-minute adjustments to her elaborate costume. "Yes, ma'am." Marco responded, instinctively lowering his eyes. "There's water on the floor by my quick-change area. I nearly slipped. Do your job properly or I'll have you fired." Her voice was cold, her eyes never fully acknowledging him as a person. "I'm sorry, I'll take care of it right away," Marco said, already reaching for his mop. As he cleaned the area, he could hear Vanessa complaining to her manager. "The help in these second-tier cities is always subpar. I can't wait to get back to LA." Marco felt his cheeks burn but kept his head down. This job paid better than most cleaning positions, and it included health insurance, essential for Sophia's asthma medication. The show began with an explosion of light and sound. Marco watched from the wings as Vanessa performed her opening number, her voice technically perfect but somehow mechanical. The crowd didn't seem to notice or care, they screamed and sang along to every word. Halfway through the set, Vanessa moved to the center of the stage for her audience participation segment. "So, who wants to sing with me tonight?" she called out, as thousands of hands shot into the air. Marco continued his work, half listening as Vanessa's banter with the audience echoed through his headset. He had been instructed to stay connected to the production channel in case of cleanup emergencies. "Wait, I have a better idea," Vanessa's voice suddenly took on a mischievous tone. "I heard someone backstage has a pretty voice. Let's bring him out instead." Marco froze as Alex, the production assistant from earlier, appeared beside him with an apologetic look. "She overheard us talking. I'm so sorry, she's insisting." Before Marco could process what was happening, 2 security guards were escorting him toward the stage. His heart hammered against his ribs as the blinding lights hit his face and 20,000 people turned their attention to him. Vanessa's smile didn't reach her eyes as she addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome one of our janitorial staff. What's your name, sir?" Marco," he managed, his voice barely audible until Alex rushed forward to adjust his microphone. "Well, Marco, I heard you think you can sing." Vanessa's tone was playful, but there was an edge to it. "Let's see what you've got. Do you know my song, Unstoppable?" Marco nodded, though his mind was racing with panic. He recognized this for what it was, public humiliation disguised as entertainment. Vanessa expected him to fail, to provide a moment of comedy at his expense before she graciously took over and showed how it should be done. The music began, and Marco closed his eyes. He thought of Sophia, who would be horrified to see her father mocked on stage. He thought of Maria, who had always believed in his voice even when he'd stopped believing in it himself. And then, he sang. The first note was tentative, but by the second line, something shifted. Marco opened his eyes to see Vanessa's smug expression falter. The audience, which had been murmuring with anticipation of a train wreck, fell silent. Marco's voice soared through the arena, rich, soulful, and filled with an emotional depth that the original recording lacked. When he reached the chorus, he hit a note that Vanessa always modified in live performances, a note that was in the original recording but beyond her natural range. He held it, pure and unwavering. The crowd erupted. Phones were raised everywhere, capturing the moment. Vanessa's face cycled through shock, embarrassment, and then a forced smile as she tried to join in for the second chorus. But Marco was in another world now, his voice transforming the pop anthem into something transcendent. As the song ended, the applause was deafening. Marco stood frozen, suddenly aware of what had just happened. Vanessa quickly took control, laughing a little too loudly. "Wow! Looks like we have a hidden talent on our cleaning crew. Give it up for Marco, everyone." The audience responded with a standing ovation. Marco caught Alex's eye off stage, the young man giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up. Then security was there again, escorting him back to the wings as Vanessa launched into her next number, her voice noticeably strained as she tried to recapture the audience's full attention. By the time Marco clocked out at 2 a.m., his phone had 17 missed calls and 38 text messages. The first was from his mother-in-law, "Marco, you're all over the internet." The next morning, as he made breakfast for Sophia, his daughter stared at him with wide eyes. "Dad, you're famous. Layla showed me the video in homeroom. You have millions of views." Marco smiled tiredly. "Eat your cereal, Mija. I'm still just your dad." But the world had other ideas. By noon, 3 local news stations had called. By dinner, a talent agent from Los Angeles had somehow gotten his number. And by the time he tucked Sophia into bed, the original video had 27 million views, and hashtag Janitor with the voice of an angel was trending nationwide. "Are you going to be a singer now?" Sophia asked as he pulled her blanket up to her chin. Marco brushed her hair back from her forehead. "I'm your dad first. Always. But you could be both," she said with the simple logic of childhood. "Mom would want you to sing again. She always said you had the most beautiful voice in the world." Marco's throat tightened. "We'll see, Mija. Now sleep." The next day at work, Marco was called into the arena manager's office. He expected to be fired. Surely Vanessa Reeves' management had complained about the incident. Instead, he found the manager beaming. "Marco. The man of the hour. Please, sit down." Confused, Marco perched on the edge of a chair. "I've had calls all morning," the manager continued. "Record labels, TV shows, you name it. The arena's phone system crashed. And ticket requests, we could fill this place 3 times over if you agreed to perform." "Perform?" Marco echoed, feeling like he'd stepped into someone else's life. "Just a short set. Opening for some local acts we already had scheduled. Paid, of course. Very well paid." Marco stared at his calloused hands. "I have a daughter. A routine. I can't just." "Marco," the manager leaned forward, "this could change your life. Both your lives." 3 weeks later, Marco stood in the wings of the same stage where everything had changed. But this time, he wasn't holding a mop. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a blue button-down shirt, nothing like Vanessa Reeves' elaborate costumes. Sofia sat backstage with his mother-in-law, both of them practically vibrating with excitement. The talent agent who'd signed him, a straightforward woman named Diane who reminded him of his late wife, had negotiated a remarkable deal. Tonight was a test run, a 15-minute set before the main act. If it went well, there would be a recording contract, with terms that specifically accommodated his role as Sofia's primary caregiver. 5 minutes, Mr. Diaz, a stagehand called. Marco nodded, his throat dry. What if the viral moment had been a fluke? What if he couldn't replicate that magic? A small hand slipped into his. Sofia looked up at him, her eyes, so like Maria's, full of confidence. "You're going to be amazing, Dad." Marco squeezed her hand. "If I forget the words, I'm counting on you to shout them from backstage." She giggled. "You never forget words. You remember every single lullaby, even the ones in Spanish that Abuela taught you." The stage manager appeared. "We're ready for you, Mr. Diaz." Marco kissed the top of Sofia's head. "This is for you and Mom, Mija." As he walked onto the stage, the roar of the crowd washed over him. The same arena that had witnessed his humiliation now welcomed him as a headliner. The spotlight found him, and for a moment, he was that terrified janitor again, certain he was about to be mocked. But then he saw the signs in the audience: Marco's voice equals pure soul, and single dads rock, and even janitors with talent. These people weren't here to laugh at him. They were here because his voice had touched something in them. Marco stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. I'm still getting used to being on this side of the mop." The crowd laughed warmly. "I'd like to sing something special tonight. It's a lullaby I used to sing to my daughter when she was small. I still sing it sometimes, when the world feels too big for both of us." The first notes of guitar filled the arena as Marco closed his eyes and began to sing. His voice, untrained but pure, carried the Spanish lullaby his grandmother had taught him, the one he'd been humming when Alex first heard him. In the front row, Alex Chen smiled, recording the moment on his phone. Beside him sat the arena manager, already calculating how many more shows they could book. And in the wings, Sophia watched her father with tears streaming down her face, her small hand clutched in her grandmother's. Marco opened his eyes as he finished the lullaby, surprised to find his cheeks wet. The arena was silent for one breathtaking moment before erupting into applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. As he moved into his second song, Marco caught sight of a familiar face slipping into the back of the arena. Vanessa Reeves, wearing dark glasses and a hat pulled low, watched from the shadows. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Marco offered a small nod. She hesitated, then nodded back before disappearing into the crowd. 6 months later, Marco sat in a comfortable studio chair, facing a popular talk show host. "So, Marco, your debut album, Night Shift, has been at the top of the charts for 3 weeks now. How has life changed?" Marco smiled, more at ease in the spotlight now, though still somewhat amazed by the turn his life had taken. "Well, I don't mop floors anymore, at least not professionally. I still clean my own house, much to my daughter's embarrassment." The audience laughed. "The biggest change is that I can be there when Sophia gets home from school every day. The studio works around her schedule, not the other way around. That was non-negotiable for me." "And what about Vanessa Reeves? Have you spoken since that night?" Marco's expression grew thoughtful. "We have, actually. Contrary to what people might think, Vanessa reached out to apologize. We had coffee. She's under enormous pressure, has been since she was a teenager. I think that night was a wake-up call for both of us." What Marco didn't share was the depth of their conversation, how Vanessa had broken down, admitting that she hadn't truly enjoyed music in years, that she felt trapped in a persona she'd created. How they'd talked for hours about the soul of music versus the business of it. How she was now taking a break from touring to rediscover why she'd wanted to sing in the first place. "Your story has inspired so many people," the host continued. "The single dad, working multiple jobs, hiding this incredible talent. Did you ever imagine this outcome?" Marco shook his head. "Never. I'd made peace with the fact that music would be something private, just between me and my daughter. But life has a way of surprising you. One last question before we hear you perform your hit single. What would you say to people out there who might be hiding their own talents, afraid to share them with the world?" Marco thought of the janitors and waitresses and bus drivers who'd written to him, sharing their own dreams. He thought of Sophia, now taking guitar lessons and writing her own songs without fear of judgment. "I'd say that talent doesn't have an expiration date. That it's never too late to be discovered, by others or by yourself. And that sometimes, the very thing you think makes you vulnerable, in my case, being put on that stage to be mocked, can become your greatest strength if you're brave enough to own it." As the interview ended and Marco prepared to sing, he glanced toward the side of the stage where Sophia stood watching, her face alight with pride. In that moment, he wasn't a chart-topping artist or a viral sensation. He was simply a father who had found a way to turn his love, for his daughter, for music, for the memory of his wife, into something that could touch others. The music began, and Marco closed his eyes, finding that same place of truth he discovered on stage 6 months ago. His voice filled the studio, carrying notes that told of struggle and loss, of daily courage and unexpected joy, notes that Vanessa Reeves, for all her technical training, had never been able to reach. If this story of perseverance against all odds touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Remember, sometimes our greatest talents remain hidden until the moment we're brave enough to share them with the world. Marco's journey from janitor to star reminds us all that it's never too late to follow your dreams, and that sometimes, the most beautiful voices come from the most unexpected places. As Marco's career flourished over the next year, he remained grounded in what mattered most. He bought a modest house in the same neighborhood, ensuring Sophia could stay at her school with her friends. The basement he converted into a small recording studio where local musicians, many of them working people with hidden talents, could record demos for free. Vanessa Reeves' career took an unexpected turn as well. After her 6-month hiatus, she re-emerged with an acoustic album that shocked critics and fans alike. Gone were the overproduced tracks and auto-tuned perfection, replaced by raw, vulnerable songs that showcased a voice few knew she possessed. In interviews, she openly credited Marco with inspiring her transformation. "Watching someone sing from their soul made me realize how disconnected I'd become from mine," she told Rolling Stone. "I'd been so focused on hitting the right notes that I forgot what music is supposed to make you feel." The two unlikely friends eventually collaborated on a duet that became the theme for a documentary about undiscovered talents in everyday workplaces. The project funded music education in underprivileged schools across the country, including Sophia's. On the anniversary of that fateful night, Marco returned to the Westfield Arena, not as a performer, but as the host of Hidden Harmonies, a talent showcase for service workers, healthcare aides, teachers, and others whose artistic gifts often went unnoticed amid their daily responsibilities. Backstage, he found himself standing in the same spot where he'd once clutched his mop in anonymity. Alex Chen, now the show's producer, approached with a clipboard. "Ready to go, Marco? We've got a full house." Marco nodded, straightening his jacket. "Is our special guest here?" "In the green room." "Nervous as hell, just like you were." Tonight's featured performer was Darlene Williams, a 67-year-old hospital cafeteria worker whose gospel voice had been discovered when she sang to comfort a young patient. Marco had personally invited her after seeing a cell phone video that had moved him to tears. He knocked gently on the green room door. "Ms. Williams?" "It's Marco Diaz." The woman who opened the door had kind eyes and hands worn from decades of work. She clutched a handkerchief, her expression a mixture of terror and excitement. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "These people paid to see professionals." Marco smiled, recognizing his own fears from a year ago. "They paid to feel something real. And trust me, when you sing, they will." He led her toward the stage, stopping just before the curtain. "Can I tell you a secret, Ms. Williams? I still get scared every single time. But then I remember something my late wife used to say, fear and excitement feel exactly the same in your body. It's your mind that decides which one it is." Darlene took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "My Harold, he passed 10 years ago, he always said I should sing for more than just him and the Lord." "Well, tonight you will," Marco said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "And they're both listening." As he walked on stage to introduce the show, Marco caught sight of Sophia in the front row, now 12 and growing so fast it made his heart ache. Beside her sat his mother-in-law and, surprisingly, Vanessa Reeves, who had flown in specifically for this event despite her busy schedule. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marco began, his voice carrying easily through the arena that had once intimidated him, "a year ago on this stage, my life changed because someone thought my voice didn't matter. Tonight, we're here to prove that everyone's voice matters, especially those we rarely take the time to hear." The audience erupted in applause as the lights dimmed. Marco stepped aside, making room for Darlene to take center stage. As the first notes of her song began, he watched from the wings, remembering the janitor he had been and grateful for the man he had become, not because he was now famous, but because he had found a way to use his voice for something larger than himself. Later that night, after the show had ended to a standing ovation and Darlene Williams had signed her first recording contract, Marco tucked an exhausted Sophia into bed. "Dad," she murmured sleepily. "Do you think Mom can see what's happened? Do you think she knows?" Marco sat on the edge of her bed, his throat tight with emotion. "I know she does, Mija. Sometimes when I'm singing, I can feel her right there beside me." "Me too," Sophia said, her eyes drifting closed. "When you sing, it's like she's not really gone." Marco kissed her forehead, thinking of how music had always been his connection to those he loved, his grandmother, Maria, and now Sophia. How it had been his private solace during the hardest years of his life, and how it had unexpectedly become his way of connecting with thousands of others who needed to hear that ordinary lives could contain extraordinary beauty. As he turned out Sophia's light, his phone buzzed with a text from Diane, his agent. Another offer, another opportunity. But it could wait until morning. Tonight was for remembering where he'd come from and why he sang in the first place, not for fame or fortune, but because music was the purest expression of love he knew. In the quiet of his home, Marco hummed softly to himself, the same lullaby that had started everything. Outside, fans might know him as the janitor who became a star, but within these walls, he was simply a father who had found his voice again, and in doing so, had helped others find theirs. The story of Marco Diaz and Vanessa Reeves would be told for years to come, not as a tale of humiliation and revenge, but as a reminder that sometimes our greatest moments come when we're most vulnerable, and that true talent isn't measured by fame but by the ability to touch hearts with authenticity. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Maria was smiling, having always known what the world had only just discovered, that the man who had mopped floors and raised their daughter alone had always possessed a rare and beautiful gift, not just his voice, but his capacity to remain kind in a world that hadn't always been kind to him. That was the true high note that Marco Diaz had hit, one that no amount of training could teach, and that would resonate long after the applause had faded. As the years passed, Marco's influence extended far beyond music. The Hidden Harmonies talent show became an annual television event, broadcast nationally and spawning regional competitions across the country. Plumbers, teachers, bus drivers, nurses, people from all walks of life found their moment in the spotlight, not just to showcase their talents but to remind viewers that extraordinary gifts often hide in plain sight. 5 years after that fateful night at the Westfield Arena, Marco stood backstage at the Grammy Awards, adjusting his tie nervously. His third album, Everyday Miracles, had been nominated for Album of the Year, a collection of songs written about the ordinary heroes he'd met through his journey. "Dad, stop fidgeting," Sophia said, now a poised 16-year-old with Maria's eyes and a confidence that made Marco's heart swell with pride. "You look perfect." "When did you become the parent?" he teased, smoothing her hair. Sophia rolled her eyes but smiled. "Around the same time you became a fashion icon. People magazine's most stylish dad in music?" "Really?" Marco laughed. The transformation from janitor to celebrity still felt surreal sometimes. He'd remained the same man at his core, devoted father, loyal friend, tireless advocate for working-class artists, but his platform had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. A production assistant appeared. "5 minutes, Mr. Diaz. You're performing after the next award." As the assistant hurried away, Marco felt a familiar flutter of nerves. Tonight he would debut a new song, one he'd written for Maria on what would have been their 20th anniversary. It was the most personal piece he'd ever share publicly. "She would be so proud of you," Sophia said quietly, seeming to read his thoughts. "Both of us." Marco hugged his daughter tightly. "She would be most proud of you, Mija. Your grades, your music, your kind heart, you're the best of both of us." Sophia had inherited her father's musical talent and her mother's determination. Already, she'd composed songs for several up-and-coming artists and was considering music production programs for college. "Mr. Diaz?" A new voice interrupted their moment. They turned to find Vanessa Reeves approaching, elegant in a simple black gown, a far cry from the elaborate costumes of her earlier career. "Vanessa! I didn't know you were presenting tonight." Marco embraced her warmly. "Last-minute replacement," she explained, greeting Sophia with genuine affection. "I wanted to wish you luck, though I doubt you'll need it. That album is something special." The friendship that had developed between Marco and Vanessa surprised many in the industry, but it made perfect sense to those who knew them well. Both had experienced the transformative power of authentic expression, Marco finding his voice after years of silence, Vanessa rediscovering hers after years of commercial compromise. "How's the foundation going?" Marco asked. Vanessa brightened. "We just opened our 10th music studio in underserved communities. The one in your old neighborhood has a waiting list now." The Reeves-Diaz Foundation had become their shared passion, creating spaces where working parents and their children could access music education regardless of income. The first studio had opened in the community center where Marco had once mopped floors. "Places, everyone," the stage manager called. As Vanessa hurried to her position and Sophia gave her father one last encouraging squeeze, Marco took a moment to center himself. He thought of the journey, from the night shift at the arena to this glittering stage, from anonymity to influence, from loss to purpose. When his name was announced, the applause washed over him like a wave. He walked to the center of the stage, where a single spotlight illuminated a simple stool and microphone, no dancers, no elaborate production, just a man and his voice. "This song is called Constellations," he said into the hushed auditorium. "It's for my late wife, Maria, who taught me that love doesn't end when someone leaves this world. It just changes form, like stars that seem to disappear in the morning sky but are always there, burning bright, waiting for us to look up again." As he sang, images appeared on the screen behind him, not of Marco or Maria, but of ordinary people holding photographs of their own loved ones lost too soon. The project had been Sophia's idea, a visual chorus of remembrance to accompany his voice. In the front row, Sophia watched through tears as her father's voice filled the space with a grief made beautiful through music. Beside her sat her grandmother, Marco's mother-in-law, who had become his most devoted supporter. And scattered throughout the audience were faces that few would recognize but Marco would never forget: Alex Chen, who had first heard him singing in that dressing room, the arena manager who had given him his first real chance, Darlene Williams, now a successful gospel artist in her own right, and dozens of others whose lives had intersected with his. When the song ended, the silence was profound, a collective held breath before the audience rose in unison, the applause thunderous and sustained. Marco bowed his head, allowing himself to feel Maria's presence in that moment of connection between his most private emotions and this most public expression of them. Later that night, clutching his Grammy Award and surrounded by well-wishers at the after-party, Marco slipped away to a quiet balcony. Sophia found him there, gazing up at the night sky. "There you are," she said, joining him at the railing. "Everyone's looking for you." "Just needed a minute," he replied, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes it still feels like I'm dreaming all this." Sophia leaned her head against him. "You know what I think? I think this was always supposed to happen, just not in the way you planned. Mom used to tell me that the universe has its own timeline for our dreams." Marco smiled, remembering Maria's unshakable faith in him even when his own had faltered. "She was right about so many things. Including you," Sophia said firmly. "She always said your voice was too beautiful to stay hidden forever." Below them, the party continued, celebrities and industry executives networking and celebrating. But up here, under the vast canopy of stars, Marco was simply a father standing with his daughter, both of them carrying the memory of the woman who had loved them. "Ready to go back in?" Sophia asked after a while. Marco nodded, but paused before opening the door. "You know, for all the changes these past 5 years, the best moments are still the same ones: Sunday pancakes with you, singing together while we cook dinner, visiting Mom's favorite places. That's because fame didn't make you who you are, Dad," Sophia said with wisdom beyond her years. "It just let more people see it." As they rejoined the celebration, Marco was greeted with congratulations and praise. But the words that echoed in his heart were those of a hospital cafeteria worker he'd met recently at a foundation event, who had pulled him aside and whispered, "Before your story, I was ashamed of being a janitor while dreaming of being a writer. Now I know one doesn't cancel out the other." That night, Marco added another note to the journal he'd kept since Maria's death, a practice that had evolved from processing grief to recording gratitude. "Tonight I held a golden trophy that says I've reached the pinnacle of success, but the real achievement was never about awards. It was about showing Sophia that courage doesn't mean never being afraid, it means singing anyway. It was about honoring Maria's belief in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And it was about all the people who see themselves in my story, not because it's extraordinary, but because it isn't." The notes Vanessa couldn't hit weren't just musical ones. They were the notes of authenticity, of vulnerability, of singing not to impress but to express. Those are the notes that resonate in the spaces between hearts, that vibrate with truth long after the sound fades. Asterisk. Asterisk. I am still, in many ways, that janitor with a mop and a hidden song. And I hope I always will be. Asterisk. 10 years after Marco's viral moment, the Westfield Arena hosted a special anniversary concert. The lineup featured dozens of artists discovered through hidden harmonies, each with their own story of talent recognized late or against the odds. Backstage, Marco prepared to perform with a special guest, Vanessa Reeves, their first official duet on the stage where their paths had crossed so dramatically. Nervous? Vanessa asked as they waited in the wings. Marco smiled. Not anymore. This stage feels like home now. It should, she replied. You own part of it, after all. It was true. Marco had become a minority owner of the arena 3 years earlier, transforming its employment practices to include fair wages, flexible scheduling for parents, and a scholarship program for employees and their children. The janitorial staff now received complimentary tickets to every show, seated in excellent sections, not hidden in the back. As they took the stage together, Marco caught sight of Sophia in the front row. At 21, she had grown into a remarkable young woman, a rising music producer with her mother's compassion and her father's ear for authentic sound. Beside her sat her boyfriend, her grandmother, and a group of Marco's former co-workers from his janitorial days. 10 years ago on this stage, an unexpected moment changed both our lives, Marco addressed the crowd. Vanessa and I are living proof that sometimes our greatest humiliations can become our greatest opportunities, if we're brave enough to keep singing through them. Vanessa stepped forward. And that sometimes the notes we think are beyond our reach are just waiting for us to find the courage to try for them. As their voices blended in harmony, her technical precision complementing his emotional depth, the arena filled with the sound of two artists who had found their authentic voices by losing the fear of imperfection. When the concert ended, Marco didn't rush home or to an exclusive afterparty. Instead, he walked the empty arena after the crowds had gone, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He paused at the spot where he had stood with his mop that night, feeling the full circle of his journey. A single custodian was working late, emptying trash cans from the event. Marco approached him with a warm smile. "Thank you for your work tonight," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Marco." The young man looked surprised but pleased. "I know who you are, sir." "Everyone does." Marco shook his head. "Not sir. Just Marco. I used to do your job right here in this arena." The custodian's eyes widened. "For real?" "I mean, I heard the story, but—" "For real," Marco confirmed. "What's your name?" "James. James Okafor." "Do you like working here, James?" The young man shrugged. "It pays the bills while I finish my engineering degree. Night shifts let me take classes during the day." Marco nodded, remembering his own calculations of time and money, the constant juggling act of dreams and responsibilities. "Keep going," he said simply. "The world needs engineers who understand what it means to work hard behind the scenes. That perspective will make you better at whatever you build." As Marco finally headed home that night, he thought about the legacy he was creating, not just through his music or his foundation, but through these small moments of connection, of seeing people who often went unseen. In his quiet house, with Sofia now living in her own apartment near her university, Marco often felt Maria's presence most strongly. Tonight, he sat at the piano they had bought together when they were young and broke but full of dreams, and played the lullaby that had started everything. "We did it, mi amor," he whispered to the empty room that never felt truly empty. "Not the way we planned, but maybe better." The janitor with the voice of an angel had become much more than a viral sensation or even a Grammy-winning artist. He had become a bridge, between privilege and struggle, between opportunity and oversight, between those who had always been heard and those still waiting for their moment. And in that space between worlds, Marco Diaz had found not just his voice, but his purpose, to ensure that no one with a song in their heart would ever again feel ashamed to sing it. 15 years after that fateful night at the Westfield Arena, Marco Diaz stood in the rose garden of the White House, still somewhat disbelieving of the path his life had taken. The president was about to present him with the National Medal of Arts, not just for his music, but for the educational revolution he and Sophia had sparked across the country. The Diaz Music Initiative now operated in all 50 states, transforming abandoned buildings into community art centers where working parents could pursue creative passions alongside their children. What had begun as a personal journey had evolved into a movement that had changed thousands of lives. "You're fidgeting with your tie again, Dad," Sophia whispered beside him, now 26 and the executive director of their foundation. Her recent marriage to Miguel, a music therapist she'd met through their work, had given Marco a son-in-law who shared their vision of music as healing. "Some habits never change," Marco replied with a smile. "Your mother would be laughing at me right now." "She'd be crying proud tears," Sophia corrected gently. "Just like at my wedding." Marco nodded, remembering how palpably he had felt Maria's presence as he walked Sophia down the aisle 6 months earlier. He had performed a song for the father-daughter dance that left no dry eyes in the venue, a celebration of the journey they had taken together and the woman who had shaped them both. The ceremony began, and Marco listened as the president described his contributions to American culture. The official language spoke of artistic excellence and philanthropic impact, but what moved Marco most was the personal addition. "Mr. Diaz reminds us that greatness often exists in the most unexpected places, not just in concert halls and recording studios, but in school cafeterias and hospital corridors, in factory break rooms and yes, even while pushing a mop across a stage that one day would bear your name." It was true. The Westfield Arena had been renamed the Diaz Center for the Performing Arts 3 years earlier, with a special emphasis on showcasing talent from working-class backgrounds. The janitorial staff there now receive not just living wages but also access to music and arts education, and each year, at least one employee was featured in the center's main season. As Marco accepted the medal, he scanned the audience. In the front row sat his extended family, Sofia and Miguel, his mother-in-law, now in her 80s but still his fiercest advocate, his sister who had moved across the country to help with Sophia during those difficult early years after Maria's death. Behind them were faces representing every chapter of his journey: Alex Chen, who had risen to become a respected music producer; Vanessa Reeves, whose own artistic renaissance had inspired a generation of performers to prioritize authenticity over commercial appeal; James Okafor, the former janitor who had indeed become an engineer and now designed sustainable performance spaces for the Diaz Initiative; and Darlene Williams, the cafeteria worker whose gospel album had won her 3 Grammys and who now mentored senior citizens rediscovering their artistic voices. "This honor belongs to all of you," Marco said when it was his turn to speak. "To everyone who has ever felt invisible while holding a dream close to their heart. To every parent working multiple jobs while singing lullabies at bedtime. To every person who has ever been mocked for daring to believe they had something valuable to contribute." He paused, emotion threatening to overcome him. "And especially to Maria Diaz, my late wife, who told me something I now pass on wherever I go: your circumstances may determine where you start, but they never determine where you finish." That evening, at the reception following the ceremony, Marco found himself in conversation with the Secretary of Education, discussing the data their initiative had gathered on the impact of arts education on academic performance and community well-being. "The numbers are compelling," the Secretary acknowledged, "but what strikes me most is the cultural shift. You've helped change how we value different types of work and different types of talent." Marco nodded thoughtfully. "That was never the explicit goal, but it's perhaps the outcome I'm most proud of. No child should ever feel that their parent's occupation diminishes their worth or potential." As the night wound down, Marco slipped away from the formalities to call an old friend, Roberto Mendez, who had been the head custodian at the arena when Marco first started working there. Now retired and battling cancer, Roberto had been too ill to attend the ceremony. I saw you on TV, amigo. Roberto's voice was weak but warm. From cleaning toilets to the White House. Who would have thought? Marco laughed softly. You did, actually. Remember when you caught me singing while mopping the men's room? You said I was wasting my talent on porcelain that couldn't appreciate it. I was right, Roberto chuckled, then grew serious. But you never forgot us, Marco. That's your real legacy. Later that night, in the quiet of his hotel room, Marco opened his laptop to finish something he had been working on for years, a memoir titled, Notes from the Night Shift. What had begun as therapy during those long, lonely years after Maria's death had evolved into a chronicle not just of his unlikely rise to fame, but of the invisible workforce that kept the world running while others slept. He typed the final paragraph. Asterisk, the spotlight finds some of us early, some late, and some not at all. But the true measure of a life well lived isn't found in applause or accolades. It's in the songs we sing when no one is listening, the work we do when no one is watching, and the love we give when there's nothing to gain. Maria understood this. Sophia embodies it. And I, who once believed my voice would never matter, have been granted the extraordinary privilege of amplifying others. The notes Vanessa Reeves couldn't hit weren't just high ones, they were the deep, resonant tones of authenticity that can only come from living a life unafraid of its own truth. 20 years after Marco's viral moment, he returned to the Diaz Center for a special anniversary concert. At 57, his voice had matured like fine wine, gaining depth and character with each passing year. His hair was now streaked with silver, his face lined with the map of his journey, but his eyes still held the same humble gratitude that had endeared him to millions. The event was not just a celebration of his career but a showcase for the Diaz Initiative's most successful discoveries, from a former truck driver whose operatic tenor had earned him international acclaim to a retired kindergarten teacher whose folk compositions had become part of the American musical canon. Backstage, Marco found himself surrounded by a new generation of artists who had grown up with his story as inspiration. Among them was his newest protege, a young janitor from Detroit whose rap poetry about working-class life had caught Sophia's attention during one of their talent searches. Mr. Diaz, the young man approached nervously, I just wanted to say thank you. My dad was a custodian too. He used to hide his poetry because he thought no one would take him seriously. Marco clasped his shoulder warmly. Is he here tonight? The young man nodded. Front row. Still can't believe it. Make sure you acknowledge him during your set, Marco advised. Those moments matter more than you know. As Marco prepared for his own performance, Sophia appeared with a surprise, a video call from Vanessa Reeves, who was touring in Europe but had insisted on being part of the celebration. 20 years since I tried to humiliate you and ended up humbling myself, Vanessa said with a laugh that held no bitterness, only affection. Best mistake I ever made. For both of us, Marco agreed. Their friendship had deepened over the decades, weathering career highs and lows, Vanessa's divorce and remarriage, and their occasionally competing philanthropic visions. How's the European tour? Exhausting, she admitted. But I'm following your rule, one family meal for every performance, no matter what. It was a principle Marco had never compromised on, even at the height of his fame. Family first, always, a promise he had made to Maria and to himself when Sophia was born. When it was time for Marco to take the stage, he was introduced by a surprise guest, James Okafor, the former janitor turned engineer, now the chief architectural consultant for the Diaz Initiative. 20 years ago, a man who mopped these floors showed the world that dignity isn't determined by occupation, and talent doesn't recognize social boundaries, James said to thunderous applause. Today, we celebrate not just his music, but the movement he created, a movement that says every voice deserves to be heard, every dream deserves respect, and every person has value beyond their paycheck. Marco embraced James before turning to the audience. The theater was filled with faces representing every chapter of his journey, former co-workers, music industry executives who had once dismissed him, young artists he had mentored, and countless fans who had found their own courage through his story. In the front row sat Sophia and Miguel with their 5-year-old daughter, Maria, named for the grandmother she would never meet but whose legacy she would inherit. Beside them was Marco's mother-in-law, now in her 90s but determined to witness this milestone. 20 years ago on this stage, I was a janitor with a mop and a secret, Marco began. Today, I stand before you still that same man in all the ways that matter, still in awe of the gift of music, still grateful for each day with my family, still believing that our worth isn't in what we do but in how we love. He paused, looking directly at his granddaughter, who waved excitedly. Tonight, I want to sing something new. It's called Full Circle, and it's for little Maria, who reminds me every day that the most beautiful notes are the ones that connect generations, that carry our stories forward when we're gone. As Marco sang, images appeared on screens throughout the venue, photographs spanning his journey from young father to global icon, from night shift janitor to cultural ambassador. But interspersed with these were images of ordinary people in their workplaces, teachers, nurses, farm workers, cashiers, all with instruments or microphones, all creating art alongside their daily labor. The final image was one that few in the audience had seen before, a photograph of Marco and Maria on their wedding day, young and radiant with possibility, unaware of the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. When the concert ended, Marco didn't rush away. Instead, he spent hours greeting fans, signing copies of his memoir, and listening to the stories of those who had found their own voices because of his. An elderly woman in a hospital cafeteria uniform. A middle-aged man who drove a school bus by day and conducted a community orchestra by night. A teenage girl whose single father worked as a security guard while writing poetry. It was nearly midnight when Marco finally headed home, driving himself rather than taking the offered limousine. He still lived in the same neighborhood, in a house only slightly larger than the one he had first purchased after his success. His wealth had gone primarily to the foundation, to Sophia's future, and to creating opportunities for others. At home, he found Sophia waiting up for him, little Maria asleep on her lap. She insisted on staying awake until Abuelo came home, Sophia explained softly. I told her you might be very late. Never too late for her, Marco said, carefully lifting his sleeping granddaughter. As he carried her to the guest room that was permanently set up for her visits, he hummed the same lullaby he had once sung to Sophia, that his mother had sung to him, that seemed to connect all the generations of his family across time. After tucking Maria in, he rejoined Sophia in the living room. 20 years, she marveled, shaking her head. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like another lifetime. Both, Marco agreed, settling into his favorite chair. I still have moments when I expect to wake up and find myself heading to the night shift. Sophia studied her father's face. Are you happy, Dad? Truly happy? Marco considered the question with the thoughtfulness it deserved. I'm content, he said finally. Which I think is better than happy. Happy comes and goes, but content has roots. Mom would be proud of those roots, Sophia said. Of how you've grown something so beautiful from such difficult soil. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, father and daughter who had weathered so much together. You know what I think about sometimes? Marco said eventually. How different our lives would be if Vanessa Reeves had never tried to humiliate me that night. If I had just stayed invisible, mopping floors until my body gave out. You wouldn't have stayed invisible forever, Sophia said with certainty. Your voice was always meant to be heard. If not that night, then another. Marco smiled at his daughter's faith, so like her mother's. Perhaps. But I'm grateful it happened when it did, while you were young enough to build your own dreams alongside mine, while your grandmother was still strong enough to see it all unfold. As Sophia prepared to leave, promising to return with Miguel for Sunday dinner, she paused at the door. The little girl whose father is a security guard? The one you spoke with tonight? She's joining our youth program next week. Marco nodded, unsurprised. Sophia never missed an opportunity to extend their work. She told me she wants to be just like you when she grows up, Sophia continued. I told her that was a worthy goal, but that she should also be exactly who she is, because that's what you would tell her. After Sophia left, Marco sat alone in his living room, surrounded by the physical manifestations of his journey, platinum records on the walls, the National Medal of Arts in a simple frame, family photographs documenting the years. But his most treasured possession sat on the mantel, Maria's old cassette recorder, which she had used to capture his singing when they were first married. You were right, mi amor, he said softly to the empty room that never felt truly empty. The world did need my voice. Just not in the way we thought. He pressed play on the ancient device, and his younger self filled the room, singing a love song to Maria before fame, before loss, before everything changed. The quality was poor, the tape worn from countless playings, but the emotion in that young janitor's voice was unmistakable. It was the voice of a man who loved deeply, who dreamed quietly, who found beauty in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life. It was the voice that had always been there, waiting for its moment to be heard. And in that voice, past and present, public and private, was the truth that Marco Diaz had spent 20 years sharing with the world, that sometimes the most powerful notes are the ones we sing when no one is listening, and sometimes the most important stages are the ones we clean rather than the ones we stand upon. The janitor with the voice of an angel had become a legend not because he had reached notes Vanessa Reeves never could, but because he had shown that true artistry isn't about technical perfection, it's about having the courage to sing your own song, in your own voice, no matter who is or isn't listening. That was the legacy Marco Diaz would leave behind, not just in recordings or awards or buildings bearing his name, but in the countless ordinary people who now dared to share their extraordinary gifts with a world finally ready to hear them. 25 years after Marco's life-changing moment on stage, the Diaz Initiative celebrated its silver anniversary with a global concert series spanning 5 continents. What had begun as one man's unexpected journey had blossomed into an international movement that had discovered thousands of hidden talents and transformed cultural perceptions about work, art, and human potential. At 62, Marco had gradually stepped back from the spotlight, allowing Sofia to take the lead in their foundation's daily operations while he focused on mentoring and the more intimate aspects of their mission. His hair was now fully silver, his face deeply lined with the map of his experiences, but his voice remained a powerful instrument, perhaps not as technically perfect as in his younger years, but infused with the wisdom and depth that only time could provide. The anniversary celebration culminated in a return to where it all began, the Diaz Center, formerly the Westfield Arena. For this special occasion, the stage had been transformed to recreate the setting of that fateful night, complete with a janitor's cart positioned at the edge of the performance area. Backstage, Marco adjusted his simple black suit, no longer nervous before performances but still feeling the weight of the moment. This would likely be his last major public concert, a decision he had made not out of necessity but choice, wanting to devote more time to his growing family and to the one-on-one mentoring work that brought him the most joy. A knock at his dressing room door revealed 7-year-old Maria, dressed in a sparkling blue dress, her dark curls framing a face that sometimes startled Marco with its resemblance to his late wife. Abuelo. Mama says it's almost time. She bounced on her toes with excitement. Marco knelt to her level, straightening the butterfly clip in her hair. Are you ready for your big moment, Mija? Maria nodded solemnly. I practiced every day. Just like you told me. Tonight, for the first time, his granddaughter would join him on stage for one song, a duet they had been rehearsing for months. It would be a passing of the torch, not just within his family but symbolically for the movement he had created. I have something for you, Marco said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a musical note. It's beautiful. Maria gasped. It belonged to your grandmother, Marco explained, fastening it around her neck. Your mama wore it for her first recital, and now it's your turn. Maria touched the pendant reverently. Will Abuela be watching tonight? Marco smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. From the best seat in the house, Mija. When it was time, Marco walked onto the stage to a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The audience was a tapestry of faces representing every chapter of his journey, music industry veterans who had once dismissed him, artists whose careers he had helped launch, and thousands of ordinary people who had found courage in his story. In the front row sat his family, Sophia and Miguel, their younger children, 7-year-old twins Lucas and Elena, his mother-in-law, now 95 and frail but determined to witness this milestone, and a special guest, Vanessa Reeves, who had flown in despite her recent health struggles. 25 years ago, I stood on this stage as a different man, Marco began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed arena. A man who believed his dreams had an expiration date. A man who thought his most important role was invisible, necessary but unseen. He walked to the janitor's cart and placed his hand on it. This cart represents not just where I came from, but the dignity of work that sustains us all. The hands that clean our spaces, serve our food, drive our buses, care for our children and our elders, these hands often hold dreams as vast and beautiful as any star on this stage. Marco paused, looking out at the sea of faces. The Diaz initiative was never just about finding hidden singing talents. It was about challenging the very notion of what we value and who we see. About recognizing that the measure of a society isn't found in its celebrities, but in how it treats those who serve without recognition or applause. He moved to the center of the stage, where a simple piano waited. Tonight, I want to share something special with you. For 25 years, I've sung about my journey, about Maria, about second chances and unexpected paths. But tonight, I want to sing about the future. Marco gestured toward the wings, and little Maria walked out, her steps careful but confident. A collective "ah" rippled through the audience as she joined her grandfather at the piano. "This is my granddaughter, Maria Diaz Navarro," Marco said proudly. "Named for the grandmother she never met but whose spirit lives on in our family and in our work. Tonight, we're going to sing a song we wrote together called Invisible No More." As Marco's fingers found the keys, his granddaughter's clear, pure voice filled the arena, a voice untrained but natural, reminiscent of his own before fame had polished it. When Marco joined in harmony, the effect was magical, past and future blending in perfect synchronicity, the circle of their family story made complete. From her seat in the front row, Sophia watched through tears as her father and daughter created a moment that transcended performance. Beside her, Vanessa Reeves, now in her 70s and long retired from performing, reached over to squeeze her hand. "Your father changed my life," Vanessa whispered. "He taught me what music is really for." When the song ended, the applause was deafening. Little Maria curtsied as Marco had taught her, then impulsively threw her arms around her grandfather's waist. The spontaneous gesture of love brought another wave of emotion from the audience. After Maria returned to her seat, Marco moved to the edge of the stage. "For my final song tonight, I want to honor where this all began. 25 years ago, Vanessa Reeves asked me to sing her hit, Unstoppable. It was meant to be a moment of humiliation, but it became a moment of transformation, for both of us." He looked directly at Vanessa in the front row. "Vanessa, thank you for that night. Thank you for the friendship that grew from it. And thank you for showing that true artistry includes the courage to evolve." As Marco began to sing, Unstoppable, the arrangement was stripped down to just his voice and piano, no production, no effects, just raw emotion. The song that had once been a vehicle for his public shaming had been reclaimed and transformed, just as he had transformed the narrative of his life. When he reached the famous high note, the one Vanessa had never been able to hit in live performances, Marco didn't try to replicate his younger self's technical perfection. Instead, he took the note and bent it, adding a soulful break that spoke of years lived, losses endured, and joys discovered. It wasn't perfect, but it was authentic, and infinitely more powerful. As the final notes faded, Marco remained at the piano for a moment, head bowed. When he looked up, his eyes were wet but his smile was radiant. 25 years ago, I was a janitor with a mop and a secret gift. Today, I stand before you still that same man in all the ways that matter, still grateful, still in awe of the power of music to connect us, still believing that our worth isn't defined by our occupation but by how we love and how we serve." He stood, moving to center stage for his final words. "The Diaz initiative will continue under my daughter Sophia's brilliant leadership, discovering new voices in unexpected places. But my personal mission has evolved. Beginning next month, I'll be launching the Night Shift Arts program, bringing music, visual arts, and creative writing directly to workplaces during overnight hours, meeting people exactly where they are." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. It was a perfect evolution of Marco's work, returning to the night shifts where his own journey had begun, bringing light to those who worked in darkness. "Thank you for 25 extraordinary years," Marco concluded. "And remember, the most beautiful songs are often sung when no one is listening, and the most important work is often done when no one is watching. Be kind to those who serve you. Look them in the eye. Learn their names. And remember that every person you meet has depths you cannot imagine and gifts you cannot see, until someone offers them a microphone and the courage to use it." Later that night, long after the crowds had dispersed and the cleanup crews had finished their work, Marco returned to the empty arena. He had done this after every anniversary concert, a private ritual that kept him connected to his beginnings. The security guard, recognizing him, simply nodded and let him pass. "Take your time, Mr. Diaz." In the vast, silent space, Marco walked to center stage and stood in the darkness, remembering the terror and exhilaration of that night 25 years ago. Then he moved to the wings, to the exact spot where he had once waited with his mop cart, invisible to the audience but essential to the functioning of the venue. From his pocket, he took a small photograph, Maria on their wedding day, laughing as he twirled her under his arm. It was worn from years of handling, carried in his wallet through every phase of his journey. "We did it, mi amor," he whispered. "Not the way we planned, but maybe better than we could have imagined." As he prepared to leave, Marco noticed a young woman in a custodial uniform mopping the backstage area. She had earbuds in and was singing softly to herself, unaware of his presence. For a moment, Marco simply listened. Her voice was untrained but soulful, with a natural vibrato that reminded him of Aretha Franklin. When she turned and saw him, she gasped, yanking out her earbuds. "Mr. Diaz. I'm so sorry, I didn't know anyone was still here." "Please, don't stop on my account," Marco said warmly. "You have a beautiful voice." The young woman blushed. "Thank you. I sing in my church choir, but you know, bills need paying." Marco nodded, understanding completely. "What's your name?" "Tasha Williams." "Any relation to Darlene Williams?" he asked, thinking of the cafeteria worker who had become a gospel legend. Tasha's eyes widened. "She was my great-aunt." "How did you know?" Marco smiled. "The gift runs in the family, clearly." "Tasha, would you be interested in our night shift arts program? We're just getting started, but we'll have vocal coaches coming directly to workplaces." "Are you serious?" Tasha clutched her mop handle. "That would be amazing." As Marco wrote down the information for her, he felt the perfect symmetry of the moment, standing backstage with a custodian whose hidden talent deserved recognition, exactly as he had been 25 years earlier. The circle was complete. Walking to his car in the deserted parking lot, Marco looked up at the night sky. A full moon illuminated the world in silver light, reminding him of something Maria had once said during their early struggling years: "The same moon shines on the rich and the poor, mi amor. The same stars sing for all of us." At 62, Marco Diaz had achieved more than he had ever dreamed possible, not just in terms of personal success, but in changing cultural perceptions about work, talent, and human dignity. Yet his greatest accomplishment wasn't measured in album sales or awards or buildings bearing his name. It was measured in the thousands of people who had found their voices because of his courage. In the janitors and waitresses and bus drivers who no longer felt invisible. In his daughter who had taken his vision and expanded it beyond what he could have imagined. And in his granddaughter who would carry their family's legacy of music and service into a future he might not see but had helped to shape. As he drove home through the quiet streets, Marco hummed the lullaby that had started everything, the one his grandmother had taught him, that he had sung to Sophia, that Sophia now sang to her children. The melody that connected generations, that had survived loss and celebrated joy, that had been there in the darkest nights and the brightest moments of triumph. It was, after all, the most important song he had ever sung, not because millions had heard it, but because it had been sung with love when no one was listening. And in that simple truth lay the essence of Marco Diaz's legacy, that our most profound impact often comes not from the grand gestures that capture the world's attention, but from the quiet moments of authenticity that touch one heart at a time. The janitor with the voice of an angel had become a legend not by leaving his humble beginnings behind, but by elevating them, by showing that dignity exists in all work, that talent knows no social boundaries, and that sometimes the most powerful notes are the ones that bridge worlds previously thought separate. That was the final, perfect note that Marco Diaz had hit, one that would resonate long after his own voice fell silent, carried forward by all those who had found the courage to sing their own songs because he had first sung his. 30 years after Marco's life-changing performance, the world gathered to celebrate not just a musical legacy but a cultural transformation. The Diaz Initiative had become a global phenomenon, with branches in 47 countries and a profound impact on how society valued both artistic expression and essential work. At 67, Marco had fully embraced his role as elder statesman of the movement he had inadvertently created. His performing days were largely behind him, his voice now reserved for intimate gatherings, mentoring sessions, and the lullabies he sang to his growing brood of grandchildren. The silver in his hair had completely taken over, and the lines on his face had deepened, but his eyes still held the same humble warmth that had endeared him to millions. The 30th anniversary celebration took place not in a concert hall but in the sprawling community arts complex that had been built on the site of the factory where Marco had worked his first janitorial job. The Diaz Cultural Center was a marvel of inclusive design, created by James Okafor's architectural firm with input from service workers, parents, and people with disabilities to ensure that art was truly accessible to all. The event was being broadcast globally, but the in-person gathering was intentionally intimate. Former night shift workers Marco had known, artists discovered through the initiative, family members, and close friends who had been part of the journey from the beginning. Marco sat in the front row between Sophia, now 51 and a respected cultural leader in her own right, and his mother-in-law, who at 100 had defied all expectations by living to see this milestone. Though frail and in a wheelchair, Elena Diaz's mind remained sharp, her pride in her son-in-law evident in her rheumy eyes. On stage, 12-year-old Maria Diaz Navarro, no longer the little girl who had made her debut 5 years earlier but a poised preteen with her grandmother's soulful eyes and her grandfather's natural musicality, was performing an original composition. Her younger siblings, the twins Lucas and Elena, now 12, watched from the wings, waiting for their cue to join her for the finale. As Marco watched his grandchildren perform, he felt the sweet ache of time's passage. 30 years had transformed not just his own life but had created ripples that would continue long after he was gone. The thought brought not sadness but a profound sense of peace. The celebration included video tributes from artists around the world whose lives had been touched by the Diaz Initiative, from the former hospital orderly who had become a celebrated jazz saxophonist to the night security guard whose poetry was now taught in universities. Each spoke not just of musical opportunity but of the dignity Marco's story had brought to their work and their dreams. A special tribute came from an unexpected source. Vanessa Reeves, now 77 and in declining health, had recorded a message from her home in California. "Marco," she began, her once powerful voice now fragile but still commanding, "30 years ago, I tried to use you for a moment of cheap entertainment. Instead, you taught me, and the world, about the true purpose of music. Not to elevate ourselves above others, but to connect us across all the artificial boundaries we create." Her eyes, still bright in her aged face, looked directly into the camera. "You forgave me when you had every right to resent me. You showed me that reinvention is possible at any age. And you reminded me why I began singing in the first place, not for fame or acclaim, but for that pure moment of connection between souls. Thank you for 30 years of friendship and for the most important lesson of my career, that the notes that matter most are the ones that come from the heart. There wasn't a dry eye in the house as Vanessa's message concluded. Marco reached for Sophia's hand, both of them thinking of the unlikely friendship that had developed between two people who should have been adversaries. When it was Marco's turn to speak, he made his way slowly to the stage, no longer springing up steps as he once had but moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that some journeys can't be rushed. 30 years, he began, his voice still rich though softer now. 30 years since a night janitor with a secret dream was pushed onto a stage as a joke and found his voice instead. 30 years of watching that single moment ripple outward in ways I could never have imagined. Marco looked out at the gathered faces, 3 generations of his family, colleagues who had become friends, and so many people whose lives had intersected with his through the initiative. People often ask me if I'm proud of what we've built. The truth is, I'm grateful rather than proud. Grateful to have lived long enough to see a world where the person who cleans your office might also be celebrated for their poetry. Where the value of essential work is recognized alongside the gift of artistic expression. Where my grandchildren grow up knowing that no dream is too humble and no job diminishes your worth as a human being. He paused, his eyes finding his mother-in-law in her wheelchair. I'm especially grateful to those who believed in me before that night, to Elena, who welcomed me into her family and supported us through Maria's illness. To Maria, whose faith in my voice never wavered even when mine did. And to Sophia, who was just a child when our lives changed but who has taken our family's legacy further than I ever could have. Marco turned his attention to the younger generation represented in the audience. To those just beginning your journeys, remember that success isn't measured by fame or fortune. It's measured by integrity, by kindness, by how you treat the person serving your coffee or cleaning your workspace. True artistry isn't about technical perfection, it's about having the courage to share your authentic self with the world. As Marco concluded his remarks, his grandchildren joined him on stage, Maria, Lucas, and Elena, along with Miguel and Sofia. 3 generations of the Diaz family stood together as a living testament to how one moment of courage could transform not just a life but a culture. The work continues, Marco said, his arm around Sofia's shoulders. The Diaz initiative is now in my daughter's capable hands, evolving to meet new challenges and discover new voices. And I am embarking on one final project, a global oral history of essential workers who create art in the margins of their lives. Because every story matters, every voice deserves to be heard, and every person has value beyond their paycheck. The celebration concluded not with a grand performance but with something more intimate, a community sing-along led by Marco and his grandchildren, teaching the audience the lullaby that had been in their family for generations. The simple melody, sung by hundreds of voices in harmony, filled the space with a warmth that no solo performance could have achieved. Later that evening, Marco sat on the porch of his home, still the same modest house he had bought after his initial success, though the neighborhood around it had transformed over the decades. Sophia sat beside him, both of them enjoying the peaceful aftermath of the day's emotions. I've been thinking about Mom a lot today, Sophia said, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. About how she never got to see any of this. Marco nodded, the familiar ache of Maria's absence never fully gone even after all these years. She saw it before anyone else did, Mija. She heard my voice when I couldn't hear it myself. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that only comes from decades of shared history. I have something to tell you, Sophia said finally. I've been waiting for the right moment. Marco turned to his daughter, noting the mixture of excitement and nervousness in her expression. Maria's been accepted to Juilliard, Sophia said, her voice catching. Full scholarship. She didn't want to tell you until after today's celebration. She didn't want to steal the spotlight. Marco's eyes filled with tears. His granddaughter, named for the wife he had lost, carrying forward not just her name but her spirit, would have opportunities that neither he nor Maria had ever dreamed possible. She wants you to help her prepare, Sophia continued. She says no one else understands her voice the way you do. Marco nodded, too moved to speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it was thick with emotion. Life has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it? Your mother would be so proud, of all of you, but especially of you, Sophia. You've taken what we started and made it something extraordinary. Sophia leaned her head against her father's shoulder, just as she had done as a child. I had a good teacher. As night fell, Marco thought about the journey of the past 30 years, from night janitor to cultural icon, from struggling single father to patriarch of a thriving family, from a man with a hidden gift to one whose voice had helped change how society valued both art and labor. The phone call came just before midnight. Sophia answered, her face growing solemn as she listened. When she hung up, she turned to Marco with tears in her eyes. That was Vanessa's daughter. She's gone. Peacefully, in her sleep. Marco closed his eyes, feeling the weight of another chapter closing. Vanessa Reeves, once his would-be humiliator, later his unlikely friend and ally, had completed her journey. Their intertwined story, which had begun with an attempt at public mockery and evolved into mutual respect and eventually genuine affection, had reached its earthly conclusion. She waited until after our celebration, Marco said softly, recognizing the timing as Vanessa's final act of friendship. She wouldn't have wanted to overshadow it. In the days that followed, as tributes to Vanessa poured in from around the world, Marco was asked repeatedly to comment on their complicated history. To each request, he gave the same response: Vanessa and I shared a moment that changed both our lives. What began as conflict became one of my most treasured friendships. We were two people who found our authentic voices by learning from each other. 1 month after the 30th anniversary celebration, Marco sat in a recording studio, not to perform, but to listen. His granddaughter Maria was recording her first professional demo, her voice a haunting blend of her namesake's warmth and her grandfather's soulful depth. As she sang, Marco closed his eyes, hearing echoes of the past and whispers of the future. The circle was complete, from his grandmother who had taught him the lullabies, to Maria who had believed in his gift, to Sophia who had carried their legacy forward, to young Maria who would take it places he could not imagine. That evening, Marco visited the cemetery where his wife was buried. It was a ritual he had maintained for 35 years, through fame and acclaim, through joy and sorrow, through all the unexpected turns his life had taken. Our granddaughter is going to Juilliard, mi amor, he said, placing fresh flowers on the grave. She has your eyes and your spirit. And your name, of course. The circle keeps turning. He sat on the bench beside the grave, feeling not the grief that had once overwhelmed him but a gentle melancholy mixed with profound gratitude. 30 years since that night, he continued, as if Maria could hear him. The night you always said would come, when the world would hear what you had always heard. I wish you could have been there to see it, but in some ways, you've been there for all of it. As twilight deepened around him, Marco sang softly, not one of his famous songs, but the simple lullaby that had started everything. The melody that had been passed down through generations, that had comforted Sophia in her grief, that now soothed his grandchildren to sleep. In that quiet moment, as his voice blended with the evening breeze, Marco Diaz understood the true legacy of his journey. It wasn't measured in album sales or awards or buildings bearing his name. It wasn't even measured in the cultural shift he had helped create. It was measured in the lullaby that would continue long after his voice fell silent. In the dignity his story had brought to those who worked in the shadows. In the grandchildren who would carry forward not just his musical gift but his belief in the value of all work and all voices. The janitor with the voice of an angel had become not just a star but a bridge, between privilege and struggle, between visibility and invisibility, between those who had always been heard and those still waiting for their moment. And in that bridging lay his greatest achievement, not the notes he had hit on stage 30 years ago, but the spaces he had helped create where others could find and share their own unique voices. As darkness fell completely, Marco stood to leave, his hand resting briefly on Maria's headstone. 30 years, mi amor. And still, when I sing, it's always for you. Walking slowly back to his car, Marco looked up at the night sky, the same stars that had witnessed his journey from night janitor to cultural icon, the same moon that Maria had said shines equally on all humanity. The circle was complete, yet ever expanding, like the ripples from that single moment 30 years ago when a man with a mop had found the courage to sing his truth on a stage meant to humiliate him. That courage had changed everything, not just for Marco Diaz and his family, but for countless others who had found their own voices because he had first found his. And in that simple truth lay the most beautiful note of all, the one that would resonate long after all others had faded into silence. 35 years after Marco's transformative night on stage, the world mourned and celebrated a life that had bridged worlds and changed perceptions. Marco Diaz passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, his family gathered around him in the modest home he had never chosen to leave despite his success. The news traveled quickly across continents, touching millions who had found inspiration in the janitor who became a star without ever forgetting where he came from. Tributes poured in from world leaders, music legends, and, most movingly, from custodial workers, night shift employees, and service staff around the globe who had found dignity in his story. In accordance with Marco's wishes, his funeral was private, attended only by family and close friends. But the public memorial that followed filled stadiums simultaneously in 12 cities worldwide, connected by live stream. Each venue featured performances not by celebrities but by working people with extraordinary talents discovered through the Diaz initiative over the decades. At the center of it all was the Diaz Cultural Center, where Sophia, now 56, stood on the stage her father had helped design, a stage where the cleaning staff received the same benefits and respect as the performers, where childcare was provided for all employees regardless of position, and where the backstage areas were as beautiful as the public spaces because Marco had insisted that dignity extended to all spaces and all workers. My father's journey began with humiliation and ended with transformation, Sophia began, her voice steady despite her grief. Not just his own transformation, but that of an entire culture. He showed us that the person cleaning your office might have the voice of an angel. That the woman serving your coffee might be a brilliant poet. That dignity isn't bestowed by occupation but inherent in our humanity. In the front row sat Marco's grandchildren, Maria, now 17 and preparing to begin her studies at Juilliard, the twins Lucas and Elena, 17 as well and already showing signs of carrying forward their grandfather's legacy in their own ways, Lucas through social justice filmmaking and Elena through music therapy for trauma survivors. Beside them sat their great-grandmother, Elena Diaz, who at 105 had outlived both her daughter and son-in-law but remained clear-eyed and determined to witness this final chapter of their story. Her frail hand rested on Maria's, a living connection between generations. My father never saw himself as extraordinary, Sophia continued. Even after all the acclaim, the awards, the cultural impact of his work, he would still say his most important role was being my father and later, a grandfather to Maria, Lucas, and Elena. He measured success not by applause but by presence, by being there for Sunday pancakes, for school concerts, for quiet conversations on the porch. On screens throughout the venue and in stadiums around the world, images of Marco's life played, not just the public moments of triumph but the private ones of tenderness. Marco teaching young Sophia to ride a bike. Marco dancing with his mother-in-law at Sophia's wedding. Marco sitting on the floor playing guitar with his grandchildren. Marco in his recording studio with aspiring artists from the night shift program, his silver hair and lined face contrasting with their youth but his eyes alight with the same passion. In his final weeks, Sophia shared, her voice finally breaking, as he faced his diagnosis with the same quiet courage that defined his life, my father worked on one last project. He asked me to ensure it was completed after he was gone. She gestured, and the screens changed to show the cover of a book, Invisible No More, The Dignity of Essential Work and the Power of Art, by Marco Diaz. This book, which will be distributed for free to schools, community centers, and workplaces around the world, contains not just my father's story but the stories of hundreds of essential workers who create art in the margins of their lives. It is his final gift, a testament to his belief that every voice matters, every story deserves to be heard, and every person has value beyond their paycheck. As Sophia concluded her remarks, she invited her daughter Maria to the stage. At 17, Maria Diaz Navarro stood poised at the threshold of her own artistic journey, her resemblance to her namesake grandmother striking in her dark eyes and determined expression. "My grandfather taught me many things," Maria began, her voice clear and confident. "How to hold a note until it breaks your heart. How to look a person in the eye when they're speaking to you, whether they're the president or the person cleaning your room. How to find beauty in ordinary moments." She paused, composing herself. "But the most important thing he taught me was this, that our voices are not just for ourselves. They are bridges between hearts, between experiences, between worlds that might otherwise never connect. And that the true measure of a voice isn't in its technical perfection but in its authenticity, in its power to make someone else feel less alone." Maria moved to the piano, the same instrument her grandfather had played for decades, now hers by inheritance and by shared passion. "This is the lullaby that has been in our family for generations. The one my great-grandmother taught my grandfather, that he sang to my mother, that my mother sang to me. It's called Siempre Conmigo, Always With Me." As Maria's fingers found the keys and her voice filled the space, the melody that had been the thread connecting all the chapters of Marco's journey took flight once more, carried now by the next generation, transformed yet recognizable, evolving yet eternal. Around the world, in stadiums and living rooms, people joined in, some in Spanish, some in their own languages, all connected by the simple truth that love and music transcend all boundaries, even the final one that had taken Marco from them. 1 year after Marco's passing, the Diaz Initiative unveiled its most ambitious project yet, a global network of community arts centers specifically designed for night shift workers, named the Night Shift Legacy, in Marco's honor. Each center would provide arts education, performance spaces, and recording facilities for those whose working hours had traditionally excluded them from cultural participation. The flagship center opened in Marco's old neighborhood, in a renovated factory where he had once worked as a young man. At the dedication ceremony, Sofia stood with her children and her mother-in-law, now 106 and determined to witness this continuation of Marco's work. "My father believed that art belongs to everyone," Sophia said, addressing the gathered crowd of community members, former colleagues, and night shift workers from across the city. "Not just to those with leisure time and disposable income, but to those who clean our offices while we sleep, who stock our shelves in the midnight hours, who care for our sick when the world grows quiet." As she cut the ribbon, the doors opened to reveal a space designed with input from night shift workers themselves, a place where parents could bring children for late-night arts programs, where recording studios operated around the clock, where gallery spaces showcased art created by those who worked while others slept. The first exhibition featured photographs taken by night janitors, security guards, and hospital staff, images capturing the beauty and solitude of the world after dark, the dignity of essential work, and the dreams that flourished in the margins of demanding lives. In the center of the main hall stood a simple bronze statue, not of Marco in his later years as a celebrated artist, but of a younger Marco in his janitor's uniform, mop in one hand, the other extended in greeting. The plaque read simply, "Every voice matters. Every story deserves to be heard. Every person has value beyond their paycheck." Marco Diaz, 1984 to 2056. 5 years after Marco's passing, his granddaughter Maria Diaz Navarro made her debut at Carnegie Hall, not just as a performer but as a composer, premiering an original symphony titled The Night Shift. The piece wove together classical structures with the sounds of essential work, the rhythm of mop buckets and cash registers, the melody of hospital monitors and delivery trucks, the harmony of voices singing in empty buildings while the world slept. In the audience sat Sophia, now 60, watching her daughter with tears of pride. Beside her were Lucas and Elena, both 22 and forging their own paths, Lucas through documentaries about working-class artists, Elena through music therapy programs for essential workers suffering from burnout and trauma. The family had scattered Maria's ashes, along with those of her namesake grandmother, in the garden behind their family home, the place where Marco had taught Sophia to play guitar, where Sophia had later taught her own children, where the legacy of music and love continued to grow with each generation. As Maria's symphony reached its climax, a powerful movement that transformed the sounds of labor into a transcendent expression of human dignity, Sophia closed her eyes, feeling her father's presence as strongly as if he sat beside her. The Diaz initiative had continued to evolve under her leadership, expanding beyond music to encompass all forms of artistic expression and advocating for policy changes that recognized the value of essential work. The "Invisible No More" movement Marco had sparked had grown into a global force for cultural and economic change. But perhaps the most profound part of Marco's legacy was the most personal, the way his story had changed how his grandchildren saw the world and their place in it. None of them took for granted the opportunities they had been given. All of them understood that their privilege came with responsibility, to see those who might otherwise be invisible, to value work that might otherwise be dismissed, to use their voices not just for self-expression but for connection and change. 10 years after Marco's passing, on the 45th anniversary of that fateful night at the Westfield Arena, a special ceremony took place at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Marco's Janitor uniform, his first platinum record, and the mop he had been holding when Vanessa Reeves called him to the stage were officially inducted into the permanent collection, not just as artifacts of music history but as symbols of a cultural transformation. Sophia, now 65 with silver streaking her dark hair, stood with her family as the exhibition was unveiled. Maria, at 27, had established herself as one of the most innovative composers of her generation. The twins, Lucas and Elena, had collaborated on a documentary series about essential workers around the world who created art alongside their labor. "My father never sought immortality through fame," Sophia told the gathered dignitaries and press. "He sought connection through authenticity." The fact that his janitor's uniform now stands alongside presidential artifacts and national treasures would have both amused and humbled him. She paused, her eyes moving to the simple work clothes displayed with the same reverence as glamorous costumes from more conventional music legends. But he would have understood the symbolism, that dignity isn't determined by occupation, that value isn't measured by paycheck, and that sometimes the most profound cultural changes begin not with those in power but with those who clean up after them. As the ceremony concluded, Maria stepped forward with a surprise announcement. "Today, I'm honored to share that the Diaz Initiative is establishing the Marco Diaz Fellowship, a lifetime stipend for essential workers who create significant art alongside their labor. Not to enable them to leave their essential work, but to honor the dual contribution they make to our society, keeping our world functioning while also enriching it through their creative gifts." The first recipient, she revealed, was Tasha Williams, the young janitor Marco had discovered singing in the empty arena 10 years earlier, who had since become a celebrated gospel artist while continuing to work in building maintenance. "My grandfather believed that no one should have to choose between essential work and artistic expression," Maria explained. "This fellowship honors both callings equally, recognizing that some of our most important voices come from those who understand the dignity of all forms of labor." 20 years after Marco's passing, as the world marked the 55th anniversary of his life-changing performance, the legacy he had built continued to evolve in ways even he might never have imagined. The Diaz Initiative had become a global force not just for artistic discovery but for cultural and economic transformation. Its advocacy had helped secure living wages, healthcare, and educational opportunities for service workers in countries around the world. Its arts programs had discovered thousands of hidden talents and changed perceptions about the relationship between work, art, and human dignity. Sophia, now 75, had gradually passed leadership to her children, though she remained the spiritual heart of the organization. Maria, at 37, had become not just an acclaimed composer but a cultural ambassador, using music to bridge divides between communities. The twins, Lucas and Elena, had expanded the initiative's work into new realms, Lucas through immersive virtual reality experiences that allowed people to step into the lives of essential workers, Elena through therapeutic programs that used art to address the trauma and stress often experienced by those in service professions. On the anniversary itself, the family gathered not for a public celebration but for a private ritual that had become their tradition: Sunday pancakes at the old family home, now preserved as both residence and informal museum of their journey. As 4 generations of the Diaz family moved through the familiar rooms, Sophia, her children and their spouses, her grandchildren, including young Marco, named for the grandfather he had never met, and even a new great-grandchild, barely 6 months old, the presence of those who had gone before seemed to fill the spaces between them. In the garden where Marco and Maria's ashes had been scattered, a simple stone bench bore the words that had guided their family through triumph and loss, fame and ordinary days. The most beautiful songs are often sung when no one is listening. The most important work is often done when no one is watching. The most profound connections are often formed when we see those who might otherwise remain invisible. As the family gathered around the old piano that had been passed down through generations, Maria began to play the lullaby that had started everything, the melody that had been sung in moments of joy and grief, that had connected them across time and beyond death. One by one, they joined in, Sophia's voice now weathered but still warm, Maria's professionally trained but still authentic, the voices of the younger generation learning the cadence and meaning of their family's song. And somewhere, beyond the boundaries of the physical world, Marco and Maria Diaz listened to the harmony their love had created, a harmony that had expanded beyond their family to touch countless lives, to change cultural perceptions, and to remind the world that sometimes the most extraordinary voices come from the most ordinary places. The janitor with the voice of an angel had long since taken his final bow, but the notes he had sung continued to resonate, in the dignity now accorded to essential work, in the platforms created for overlooked talents, in the bridges built between worlds previously thought separate, and most of all, in the family that carried his legacy forward with the same humble grace that had defined his remarkable life. In the end, the story of Marco Diaz was not just about a single moment of triumph over humiliation or about an unlikely rise to fame. It was about the courage to remain authentically yourself in a world that often rewards conformity. About the dignity inherent in all forms of labor. About the power of seeing those who might otherwise remain invisible. And perhaps most importantly, it was about the truth that had guided Marco from his first tentative notes on that stage to his final breath 55 years later, that our voices are not just for ourselves but for each other, bridges across the divides that separate us, reminders of our shared humanity, and proof that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. 50 years after Marco's transformative night on stage, his legacy had become woven into the cultural fabric of society in ways that transcended music, celebrity, or even the movement he had founded. What had begun as a moment of intended humiliation had evolved into a multi-generational force for recognizing the dignity of all work and the creative potential in every person. On the golden anniversary of that fateful performance, the world celebrated not just Marco Diaz the singer, but the profound shift in perspective his story had inspired. The Diaz Initiative, now led by the 3rd generation of the family, had expanded beyond arts education and discovery to become a global advocate for what had come to be known as dignity economics, a framework that valued essential work not just through fair compensation but through respect, opportunity, and recognition. Sofia Diaz, now 91 and still sharp despite her physical frailty, sat in her wheelchair at the center of a gathering that spanned 5 generations of her family. Her silver hair formed a crown around a face lined by decades of purpose and joy, her eyes still bright with the determination that had carried forward her father's vision long after his passing. The celebration took place not in a concert hall or stadium but in the vast community complex that had grown from the original Diaz Cultural Center, a sprawling campus that now included performance spaces, recording studios, art galleries, childcare facilities, healthcare services, and educational programs, all designed to serve those whose work schedules, financial constraints, or social circumstances might otherwise exclude them from cultural participation. Maria Diaz Navarro, now 67 and an internationally acclaimed composer and cultural leader, stood at the podium addressing the gathered family, friends, and global audience watching via holographic projection. 50 years ago, my grandfather stood on a stage much like this one, a janitor with a mop and a hidden gift, she began, her voice carrying the same warm timbre that had characterized Marco's. He could never have imagined that his moment of vulnerability would spark a movement that would transform how we value both art and labor. She gestured to the wall behind her, where an interactive display showed the global impact of the Diaz initiative, thousands of art centers in communities around the world, millions of hidden talents discovered and nurtured, and countless policy changes that had improved the lives of service workers across 6 continents. But perhaps the most profound part of my grandfather's legacy isn't measured in buildings or programs or even in the artists discovered through his vision. It's measured in a fundamental shift in how we see each other, in the simple act of looking into the eyes of the person cleaning your office, serving your meal, or driving your transport, and recognizing not just their labor but their humanity, their dreams, their inherent dignity. In the front row, Sophia nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she clutched the hand of her great-granddaughter, young Sophia, named in her honor and now a promising musician in her own right at 22. The Diaz family had expanded and evolved over the decades, through marriages and births, through adoptions and chosen family connections, becoming a living embodiment of the inclusive vision Marco had championed. They represented diverse backgrounds, occupations, and artistic expressions, but all carried forward the core values that had defined Marco's life: authenticity, dignity, and the belief that every voice matters. Today, Maria continued, we announce the next evolution of my grandfather's vision, the Global Dignity Initiative, which will expand beyond the arts to address the fundamental challenges facing essential workers in our changing world. As automation and artificial intelligence transform the landscape of work, we must ensure that those who perform the labor that cannot be replaced, the caring, cleaning, serving, and nurturing that sustains our society, are valued not just economically but culturally and socially. The announcement was met with applause from around the world, as holographic participants from every continent joined in the celebration. Among them were the descendants of people whose lives had been touched by Marco's story, the granddaughter of Darlene Williams, now a minister and gospel choir director, the son of James Okafor, who had continued his father's work designing inclusive public spaces, and even the great-nephew of Vanessa Reeves, who had followed in his great-aunt's footsteps by transforming his own music career into a platform for social change. As the formal ceremony concluded, the celebration transitioned into something more intimate, a community meal where family members mingled with essential workers from across the city, sharing stories and breaking bread together in the tradition Marco had established decades earlier. Sophia, wheeled to a table surrounded by her descendants, watched with quiet satisfaction as her family continued the work of connection that had defined her father's legacy. Her daughter Maria deep in conversation with a young hospital orderly about his poetry. Her grandson Lucas, now 52 and a renowned filmmaker, listening intently to an elderly night watchman's stories. Her granddaughter Elena, a pioneering music therapist, teaching a group of children, many of them the offspring of service workers, the family lullaby that had been passed down through generations. He would be so proud, said a voice beside her. Sophia turned to find her son-in-law Miguel, now in his 70s, his once dark hair now white but his eyes still kind. Not just proud, Sophia replied, her voice soft but clear. He would be at peace, knowing that what began with his voice has become a chorus that will continue long after all of us are gone. As evening fell, the family gathered in the garden that had been created in Marco's memory, a space where plants from his childhood home in Puerto Rico grew alongside flowers Maria had loved, where pathways were designed to be accessible to all, and where a simple fountain provided the gentle background music of flowing water. At the center of the garden stood not a statue of Marco the celebrity but a bronze sculpture of hands, one holding a mop, one holding a microphone, fingers intertwined to show that dignity and artistry were never separate but always connected. Sophia's great-granddaughter Sophia approached the fountain, carrying the ancient guitar that had been passed down through generations, the instrument Marco had played during those early years of struggle, that had accompanied lullabies and Sunday morning pancake songs, that had witnessed both grief and joy. "Great-grandma," Sophia said, kneeling beside Sophia's wheelchair, "would you sing with me? The song that started everything?" Sophia nodded, her voice no longer strong but still carrying the emotion that had always been the true instrument of her family's musical gift. As Sophia's fingers found the familiar chords, 5 generations of the Diaz family formed a circle in the fading light, their voices blending in the lullaby that had connected them across time and beyond death. In that moment, the presence of those who had gone before seemed to fill the spaces between them, Marco and Maria, whose love had created this legacy, Elena, Sophia's mother-in-law, who had lived to 107 and witnessed the flowering of her son-in-law's vision, and all those whose lives had intersected with theirs over the decades, whose stories had become part of the tapestry of the Diaz family narrative. As the final notes of the lullaby faded into the evening air, Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the full circle of the journey that had begun 50 years ago with a janitor pushed onto a stage as a joke and had evolved into a movement that had changed countless lives. The notes Vanessa couldn't hit, she whispered, echoing her father's words from long ago, weren't just high ones. They were the deep, resonant tones of authenticity that can only come from living a life unafraid of its own truth. 100 years after Marco Diaz stepped onto that stage, long after all who had witnessed that original moment had passed from the earth, his story continued to inspire and transform. The world had changed in ways Marco could never have imagined, technology had reshaped the landscape of work and art, global challenges had forced humanity to reconsider its values and priorities, and the very definition of essential labor had evolved with each generation. Yet the fundamental truth Marco had embodied remained constant, that dignity isn't determined by occupation, that value isn't measured by paycheck, and that sometimes the most profound cultural changes begin with those whose voices have been overlooked. In schools around the world, children learned about the janitor's revolution, not just as a moment in music history but as a turning point in how society valued different forms of work and different expressions of talent. The Diaz Initiative, now in its 4th generation of family leadership, had evolved into a global network that encompassed not just arts education but advocacy for worker dignity, cultural inclusion, and economic justice. And in countless homes, workplaces, and community centers, people still sang the lullaby that had been in Marco's family for generations, a simple melody that had become a symbol of the enduring connection between labor and love, between ordinary moments and extraordinary potential. The janitor with the voice of an angel had long since taken his final bow, but the notes he had sung continued to resonate, in policies that recognized the essential nature of service work, in cultural spaces that welcomed those previously excluded, in educational programs that discovered hidden talents, and most of all, in the simple human act of seeing those who might otherwise remain invisible. In the end, Marco Diaz's legacy wasn't measured in fame or fortune, in buildings bearing his name or awards lining museum shelves. It was measured in the changed perception of what constitutes value and dignity in human society, a shift that had begun with one man's courage to sing his truth on a stage meant to humiliate him and had expanded into a movement that transformed how the world saw the relationship between work, art, and human worth. And perhaps that was the most beautiful note of all, the one that would continue to resonate long after all others had faded into silence. The note that reminded us that sometimes the most extraordinary voices come from the most ordinary places, and that true artistry isn't about technical perfection but about having the courage to share your authentic self with a world that desperately needs to hear it. For in that courage, the courage to stand up when others would have you kneel, to sing out when others would have you silent, to claim your dignity when others would deny it, lies the seed of all meaningful change, both personal and societal. That was the final, perfect note that Marco Diaz had hit, one that would echo through the corridors of time, carried forward by all those who had found the courage to sing their own songs because he had first sung his.